Good morning, everyone. This is Director Brashatsky. Thank you for attending the spring meeting of the Drought Interagency Coordinating Group. Before we start, I'd like to ask Nemesis Ortiz to go over the webinar logistics to assure that our meeting will go as smooth as possible. Nemesis.
Thank you, Director Brashatsky. As you can see on the webinar instructions slide, we ask that those who are joining us remotely, please mute yourselves when you are not speaking. We would like to avoid any echoing sounds or interruptions. If you are a member of the ICG and would like to speak, please type your name in the chat and we will unmute you, or feel free to unmute yourself. If you are a member of the public, please type your questions and/or comments in the chat. You can also ask to be unmuted when there is a chance for public comments. This meeting and everything written in the chat will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on the ADWR YouTube page. And lastly, if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please contact the ADWR Help Desk at 602-771-8444 or email tickets@azwater.gov. If no meeting attendees have any questions about the webinar logistics, that sums up this topic, and I will add that information to the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Nemesis. So again, I'm Tom Brashatsky, the Director of the Department of Water Resources and the co-chair of the Governor's Drought Interagency Coordinating Group. And with me is Alan Clark, the Director of the Arizona Division of Emergency Management. Would you like to say anything?
Good morning, team, and sorry I caused us to be a couple minutes late on starting, so my apologies. Thank you.
No problem. Happy to see that we are, at least in part, meeting in person. I think this will be our future, kind of these hybrid in-person and webinar-based meetings. So this group has met biannually since 2006 to make a recommendation to the governor about whether to maintain the drought emergency declaration, which has been in place since June of 1999. The ICG is an advisory group to the governor, composed of over 20 federal and state agencies and some tribes. After the presentations, we will decide on a recommendation. And members, to avoid speaking over one another, please introduce yourselves. Those online using the chat box, those in the room can do so obviously in person. We have the agenda up on the screen. Those of you in the room have the agenda in front of you. So again, as we usually do, we will have presentations from the experts in this group. We'll listen and gather the information they're presenting to us, and then that will play into the ultimate recommendation we make to the governor for continuing or not continuing the drought declaration. So our first presenter is Dr. Erin Saffel, and she's the state climatologist and the Drought Monitoring Technical Committee co-chair, and she's going to give us a drought status update and an update on the Monitoring Technical Committee activities. Dr. Saffel.
Thank you, Director. Nice to see you. Welcome, members and guests, and we can go to the next slide. And I appreciate your time here, and there we are with the kind of an overview of what we've all just experienced. If you recall, a year ago, Arizona was dealing with a dry winter and a dry spring. January to May 2022 was the third driest January to May on record. And we had an excellent monsoon last year. And after that, we had what we describe as anomalous troughing. So those are low pressure systems. You can see that big blue dot there in the west. And that brought down temperatures, and it brought multiple systems into Arizona. Generally, in active years, atmospheric rivers can contribute about 30% of our winter precipitation. And while there's still research to get that final impact, there were more than average numbers of atmospheric rivers this year. So an example was the late March event. The Aguafia River near Rock Springs rose 15 feet on March 22nd, and that was due to an atmospheric river coming in. They usually couple together with those low pressure systems. And an atmospheric river, just in general, it's a really narrow channel of water in the atmosphere. When they hit a coast and especially mountains, they can bring high amounts of precipitation. Next slide, please. So consequently, the upper and lower basins really saw tremendous precipitation this winter. Interestingly, as the West was really inundated with cold temperatures, if you look out east, Texas to Maine, temperatures were well above average. And in order to get the levels of SWE like we saw this winter, not only did we need to have high amounts of precipitation, but it needed to be cold enough. We needed to keep that precipitation as snow and not let it melt right away. So snow melt in both basins was actually delayed. And there's still snow melt expected as inflow into the Colorado River from the upper basin. Next slide, please. So this presentation is generally going over October to March, but I'll talk a little bit about April as well. But statewide precipitation from October to March was about 2.5 inches above average. We got 8.54 statewide precipitation inches in October to March. And you can see from this chart that 2019 and even 2020 looked great at the end of March. But then both monsoon seasons those years were dry. So when we're looking at these long-term trends, we're still seeing the same patterns. I mark the start of our drought as 1994 for the state, and 9 of those years have been above average precipitation, which is excellent, but 20 of those years have been below average precipitation. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned, temperature does play a role, especially when we're dealing with our winter precipitation. And if we're looking at those last 29 years, only 5 winters have been colder than normal, including this one. This past winter, though, has been the coldest in the last 29. In fact, the last time we had a winter this cold was 1984-85. So again, considering what we're looking at statewide, it's been very cold. And opposite of that, on the East Coast, if you had any folks or friends that lived out east, not as much snow because it was much warmer. So we're looking at these cold temperatures as a great thing when we're looking at that precipitation, delaying the snow melt, not only in Arizona, but also Colorado. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of the precipitation. So each one of these is looking at a month, starting with October in the upper left-hand corner and going across October, November, December, January, February, March on the bottom. And so really October, surprising to see when we're looking at that kind of green color there. That's going to be more precipitation than usual. So above average precipitation in November. Lots of cumulus clouds that we had in October. And I may have misspoke. When we go to November, there's nothing in November. You're looking at those darker colors down there, especially in the southern tier. And it was really dry in November. And as we're popping into December, that's when the atmospheric rivers started to come in, kind of late December, 1st of January. And so we got a good wallop of precipitation coming in. February dried out a little bit, but then here comes March. You know, we started March with a very strong low pressure system on March 1st, and they kept coming with 6 more systems that month. Next slide, please. And then this is looking at temperature. So when you're seeing the blues, that means it's been colder than normal. And overall, the same kind of structure. So October, November, December, January, February, March at the bottom. November in the middle upper right was the coldest November, the 14th coldest November on record. So it really started things. Even though December was a little bit warmer, we started to get that precipitation in. And then, of course, January, February, March, colder than normal, which has been excellent for our snowpack. And next slide, please. So kind of overall looking at October to March, what's been going on in the state. So the precipitation, you can see Coconino County, you can see Navajo counties. above average precipitation. They ended up in their top 10% of their precipitation when we look at our period of record. The period of record goes back to 1895. Santa Cruz, when we're looking at the coldest conditions, saw its top 10% coldest October to March. So statewide, October to March was the 21st wettest and 24th coldest on record. Really good things. Next slide, please. So just a look at April, because it was so exceptionally dry. April, May, June, we do start drying out, but April was exceptionally dry, and it tied for the third driest April in our southern tiers down there. There was no precipitation in La Paz, Maricopa, Pinal, and the southern counties. Central and southern counties were also warmer than normal. Still, it was a wet winter. And if we look at October to April now, that's still ranked in the top 20%. So even though we had a very dry April, we were still able to accommodate that with how much precipitation we had October through March. To reach a normal water year this year, the state will need another 3.5 to 4 inches statewide this summer. And that's about the average summer precipitation. I think it's helpful that to know that there are still traces. We will still receive some snow in early May, and Belmont just had about a third of its May precipitation this past Saturday. So May is looking good, much better than last year. Next slide, please. So looking at our current short-term drought, it's been greatly improved. Currently, only 1% of the state is in drought, and that's moderate drought, and that's in Northwest Mojave County. The last time short-term drought looked like this was 2019. If we dig into that a little bit, July 2018 to March 2019, that had 14.5 inches of precipitation, and that ranked the 18th wettest July to March on record. So our most recent July 2022 to March 2023, we've had 15.3 inches of precipitation, and that's ranked 12th wettest. Next slide, please. So Arizona evaluates long-term records. So we look at 24, 36, and 48-month SPEI data sets. And so when we're looking at that 48-month SPEI, which is the Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, it takes into account not just precipitation, it also takes into account temperature, which tells us how thirsty the atmosphere is. And you can see that we have seen some improvement in our long-term records. So when we're looking at those long-term records, the 48-month data includes wetter conditions from 2019, as well as the last 2 wet monsoon seasons. It even has the hottest and driest June to September on record from 2020. The previous 2 winters before this one were also dry. All of that is being evaluated when we're looking at our long-term records. So next slide, and we can see how those turned out. Here we are. So looking at our long-term maps, you can see last year, March, June, September, December, there wasn't much change in the long-term drought maps last year. But adding in this very wet winter has showed improvement in Arizona's long-term drought. So we still have extreme, severe, and moderate long-term drought that's largely in Maricopa, Yuma, La Paz, Mojave, and Coconino counties. There's a really small measure of exceptional long-term drought, and that's on the Yuma-La Paz border. But eastern and southern counties largely removed all aspects of long-term drought. Next slide, please. Thank you, and I'll answer any questions.
Questions first from members of the group around the table. Seeing none. Questions from members online? Not seeing any. I have one, Dr. Safran. I just wanted to make sure I heard correctly what you said. We had a really good 2019, followed by the driest monsoon ever on record in 2020. Is that what I heard correctly?
Yes, that's what you heard correctly. Yeah, we had a dry summer in 2019, but that winter coming from 2018 to 2019, that was a wet winter. Then we had a dry summer in 2019, and then we had another wet winter in 2019, 2020. And then the driest summer on record was 2020.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so then we will move on then to the next presentation, the 2023 weather outlook. Mark O'Malley, the lead forecaster of the National Weather Service, and also Drought Monitoring Technical Committee co-chair, is going to give us that presentation. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much, Director Bushowski. Go to the next slide, please. So the biggest story in weather and climate recently has been the decay of a La Nina cycle, and now we're quickly heading into an El Nino cycle. Through this animation, look at the Central Pacific, those really dark blues, that's the La Nina signal, and notice how quickly they dissipate and was being replaced by much warmer water along the tropical Pacific. And that's the signal of an emerging El Nino. Also note the very dark blues along the California coast and the Baja. That's abnormally cold water that's been sitting there for a while. And that may impact our monsoon coming up. Moisture availability may be compromised for the first part of the monsoon. So that's one part that goes into the forecast for the summer coming up. So if we go to the next slide, this is a prediction for the El Nino. And as you can see on this graph, there's very good agreement among the models that we'll be heading into this El Nino region as early as the summer, and certainly by the fall months. Typically, predictions of El Nino or La Nina made in the spring have a poor track record, but the confidence is much higher this year. Click ahead to the next slide. And this shows the probability, and these have actually been updated since I put together this presentation. And there's actually very high confidence that we'll be heading towards an El Nino. The probabilities are now above 90% that we'll hit El Nino thresholds come this summer. So that also goes into some of our forecasting going forward. Go to the next slide. So the Climate Prediction Center forecast for the summer depicts a better than 50% chance that the summer as a whole will be warmer than average. This pie chart embedded here is specifically for Phoenix, but it is representative for the entire region, where there's very little chance that we would be below normal during the summer. Go ahead one click ahead. And really this has to do a lot with the trend. In the past 30 to 40 years, there's been a discernible warming. We're warming greater than 0.5 degree per decade. Click ahead one more. And the last couple of years, the perception has been, well, the summers haven't been that bad, compared to 2020, which was the hottest summer on record. But if you go back prior to 1990, the last 2 summers would have been some of the hottest summers on record. For anyone who's lived here a long time, the 70s, the 80s, the early 90s weren't nearly as warm during the summer as we have been during the past 30 so years. Now, these warmer readings have a negative impact on evapotranspiration and soil moisture, and there's no signal that this is going to change anytime soon. The warming continues. We can hope that this summer is like the last 2, where we're just hovering around the 30-year average. But to get to levels where we were 40, 50, 60 years ago, that looks improbable going forward. So go ahead to the next slide. So I wanted to look at recent El Nino summers. El Nino during the summer isn't very common. a lot of times you'll have the El Nino emerging during the fall months and peaking during the winter months. But there have been a few cases where we have had an emerging or established El Nino during the summer. But going back over the past 6 El Nino summers, and this goes back to the early 90s, by and large, there's a lot of orange and reds on these maps in Arizona. There's a few exceptions. However, by and large, most of these El Nino summers for the state as a whole are drier than average. Now, given the way thunderstorms are distributed through the summer, there has been summers where there's pockets of above normal precipitation. And some years like 1997, there have been some tropical systems in the Pacific which have shed moisture northward, which has helped some of the region. However, by and large, as I said, most of these El Nino summers don't produce a large amount of precipitation across the wide area of the state. So go to the next slide. And as such, their Climate Prediction Center is showing just a very slight tilt in the odds that the southern southeast part of the state would be below average precipitation during the bulk of the monsoon. Now, this shift isn't particularly that strong. The inset for Phoenix itself, it's really almost equal odds when it comes down to it. But looking at the past couple El Ninos, and if you go to the next click ahead one, I plotted on here those past 6 El Ninos. The stars are the El Ninos that have been established, that have come in from the winter through the summer. They've been multi-year El Ninos, where the dots are the emerging El Ninos, sort of like what we're seeing this year. And so by and large, a lot of these are near to below normal. The emerging ones are the below normal years. So I don't have a lot of hope that we're going to get a very wet El Nino a monsoon this year with the El Nino. Also, the past 2 years at the very end of the graph have been very good monsoon years. Well, if you look at this past history in the state, rarely do you have 3 consecutive wet monsoons. Back in the early 80s, there was 3 fairly wet, 82, 81, 82, 83. But by and large, if you get 2 wet monsoons in a row, it's pretty difficult historically to get 3 in a row. So go to the next slide. So I talked about El Nino, and really El Nino is the largest driver during the winter months. However, El Ninos can be very fickle in the Southwest. Right now, given it's the spring, there's a little bit, the confidence is fairly high. There's uncertainty that far ahead of how this is going to affect us. Historically, there's been some El Ninos that produce wet weather in the Southwest, but there's been El Ninos such as the large one back in 2015 and 16, which had really minimal effects over the state. So these outlooks may change in the next couple of months. I'll obviously give an update once we get to November in the ICG meeting. However, I will say that we were quite, I say lucky, fortunate. It was needed that we had this past winter where we had abundant precipitation and abundant snowfall. That is very rare during a La Nina event. Going forward, I don't want to sit on counting on lucky years. Based on all the data with the temperatures and precipitation trends. We've had these interludes of wet years, but that's still incorporated in an overall drought cycle, which as Erin showed in that SPEI data. So just going forward, we need several more winters like we've had the past winter to really get out of this long-term drought. Hopefully, this El Nino winter coming up turns wet for us, but right now, there is really no shift in the odds either way. So go to the next slide. And I believe that is it. It's just a summary of warmer than average this summer. There's a slight increase for a drier monsoon. The best case this monsoon is really that some of the larger cities receive above average rainfall and help reduce the demand. And some of the headwater soil moisture is not really depleted going into next water year. However, given past experience, there probably will be several areas over the state where the soil moisture is compromised going into the next water year. And then really 90% chance of El Nino coming up, but no odds for next winter yet. So with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Mark. Questions from members around the table? Seeing none. Questions from members online? Also seeing none. Thanks, Mark. Next, we will move to Colorado River Water Supply Update. James Hefner from DWR's Colorado River Management section will give us that presentation.
Is that better? My apologies. Good morning, and thank you. System status as of May 7th, the Upper Basin, Flaming Gorge, 72%, Blue Mesa, 50%, Navajo, 73%. Lake Powell was 30 feet elevation, 5.877 million acre storage, 25% full. Lake Mead is 30% full, 7.725 million acre feet at an elevation of 1055. These numbers have obviously, well, at least in the case of Powell, have improved. It's about 9 feet higher now, 35, 38, which is great. Mead's only up probably another foot or so. Next slide, please. As for what things look like, where we're going, snowpack looks good, still looks good. We peaked early April, under 61% median, good year. Here we've got 2023 along with the 1991 to 2020 median in purple, and 2005 and 2019 in here for comparison years. The April-July runoff forecast has declined somewhat from April. It's now down to about 11 million acre feet. Next slide, please. From a water year perspective, well, this is, I apologize that they actually came out with a new graphic just late yesterday, was not able to incorporate this, but this is the April forecast ranging from 12.3 to 17.9 million acre feet. Obviously the max predicted at that point, exceeded anything we've seen in the last 30 years. You have to go back to the 80s to have something comparable. The most probable fell in, between basically 2011 and 2005 and 2019, range to expect. And again, just like the April-July forecast, the water forecast has dropped down a little bit. It's 14.17 million acre feet, and the range is actually tightened up. We're between 13 and 16 million acre feet. Again, between that 2011 at the upper end and 2005, 2019 at the bottom end. Next slide, please. Here's the often maligned spaghetti charts. This is, Lake Powell end of month elevations, April max, May and min probable for 20-month study, along with the 24-month, the 2-year probabilistic projections. End of calendar year for Powell, 3573 feet for 2023 under the most probable scenario, 3566 under the probable min scenario. End of calendar year projections of Powell for 2024, about 3586 feet, the most probable, and 3552 under the probable min. Under the projections, the releases from Powell are expected, or at least projected, from 8.7 to 9.5 under the min and most respectively. Powell is currently set as of the May projections to release about 9.3 million acre feet. And this is, of course, all under the current operating regime and water use. The assumptions have changed based on discussions with the states, the hydrology, obviously, and what's the ultimate outcome from the supplemental environmental impact statement for near-term operations. Next slide, please. And now we're looking to meet end of month elevation projections. End of calendar year projection for me, 1067 for 2023, the most probable. 1061 in the probable min scenario. 2024, we're looking at 1057 feet in the most probable and 1043 into the probable min. Obviously, this year we're operating at 2A shortage condition. Next year, we're looking, potentially tier 1 reductions, 512,000 acre feet in reductions off the bat, Arizona. Just, of course, assumes that there's no additional reductions that may materialize from the SEIS. Next slide, please. These are the April 5-year table. I take these with a grain of salt. Obviously, 2027, we don't know what post 2026 operations are going to look like. And even the near term, the probabilities exclude any possible operational changes due to that SEIS. This, and any other activities that could change the next month. But in any case, we're likely to still be in a shortage, obviously. There are some traces, or were some traces, since this is based on the April crims, that do venture above that 1075 elevation, but they generally assume the next year would be another relatively wet year, which is not impossible, but it's pretty unlikely. 2025, 2026, general improvements, probabilities, but again, with the traces representing the drier conditions like we've seen, the lake resumes a downward slide into those lower elevations over time. Next slide, please. Okay, so what could change since then? Well, obviously what we ultimately get from Lake Powell is in terms of need. Those have already, that's already been knocked down from 9.5 to 9.3 so far. Any additional system conservation by lower basin water users, which is, ongoing, those get added into the models for projections, as those deals are inked and they get sent to reclamation. What happens with California and their intentionally created surplus? Given the water on that side for them, there's a possibility of them taking less water, assuming their infrastructure can handle what they've got over in California. And of course, then there's the SEIS with its potential for additional cuts to lower basin water users on top of the existing interim guidelines and DCP. Next slide, please. So as to what that might look like in terms of total reductions, next year, you're going to look at a tier 1. That would mean an additional 533,000 acre feet on top of the existing BGDCP. This is true regardless of which action alternative would be implemented. There were 2 that were proposed in the SEIS. The volumes are the same for both. It's only the distribution that changes. Alternative 1 would actually see those, those additional cuts continue in priority. Or at least one version of priority as represented by reclamation, with Arizona, CAP and on river before taking the brunt of those reductions. And under alternative 2, the additional cuts would be shared proportionally amongst the water users. Generally speaking, each water user would see at least at that level 7.11% as applied to their 2023 adjusted consumptive use. CAP would take that on top of their existing contributions, IGTCP. The elevations highlighted here, P3 users would not see cuts under alternative 1 by priority. Below 1045, you've essentially burned through CAP and on river P4 and the implications that go therein, and you're into the more senior users. The PPRs remain untouched under the priority scheme, even at the most extreme levels of cuts here. And even, that's, again, next year doesn't necessarily look so bad, but you can definitely see the potential here if we, fall below, those cuts become potentially devastating. Next slide, please. I think that should be, is that, happy to take any questions now, or if you think of anything, my contact information is right there on the screen. Thank you.
Questions for James, folks around the table? Ed?
James or Tom, how does the 500+ plan weave into the SEIS, and are we pretty close to that tier 1 shortage with that included?
So we did hit and a little bit more, the 500+ plan goal for the first year. It was 2 years really for the first year. we're really morphing away from the 500+ plan. And it's all the same at the end of the day, whether you call it 500+, whether you call it system conservation under the Inflation Reduction Act money program. I think James showed the projection. Some of all of the 500+ plan water is already in the model, but there's some system conservation water under IRA in the model. I know James can correct me or add to the Healer and Communities deal was signed. That's in the model. The Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation deal was signed. That's in the model. Are there other ones in the model yet, James?
Right, for 2024, I'm not entirely clear on that.
So it doesn't look like we're going to stay in tier one. It looks like we're not going to get out of tier one. Other questions from members around the table? Members on the webinar? I do have one question, James. If you can go back to the Lake Powell unregulated inflow slide. I want to make sure I'm seeing this correctly, because it gets to the trends that both Mark and Aaron talked about. So the 1964 pour, so you need to keep going back. The Lake Powell unregulated inflow by year, that slide. The bar chart, yeah. So it looks to me like in 2011, we had a huge year, followed by 2 really dry years. Looks like we had a good year in 2017 and then a bad year in 18. We had a good year in 2019, 3 really bad years in 2021 and 22. So I just point out that much like we heard from our 2 previous presenters, this kind of trend of a good year followed by bad is what we've been seeing a lot in our near-term history. It remains to be seen after this good year what we'll see the next year or 2 on Colorado River, but this is not a good trend, and it's a disturbing trend that Reclamation reminds us of all the time as we're talking to them about what the future might hold and what we need to do to stabilize the system in Lake Powell and Lake Mead. So with that, thanks, James. I think the presentation. We'll move on to the next presentation, Salt River and Verde River Watershed Water Supply Update. Stephen Flora, Senior Hydrologist from SRP, and Stephen's here with us. I see lots of water flowing down that river.
Yeah, and if you were lucky to see last week, you would have seen those Roosevelt spill gates on that previous slide flowing as we did a spill gate test last week with the reservoir essentially full Roosevelt. But this year to talk about, well, we've been talking about a 27-year drought plus for the last couple decades, but when in drought, we have wet years. So, and this was one of those wet years, and whether this is one of those wet years in a drought or one of the start that transitions to a wetter period that we've seen in the record of those 20, 30-year wet, dry periods throughout the historical record is still yet to be seen. We'll have to see if this continues. But we did have a very wet year, and this is the spoiler slide here and the highlight slide. You can see some of these images. We had some pretty significant releases, especially on the Verde reservoirs. Out of Horseshoe and Bartlett dams. On the left is Horseshoe Dam. I believe that's around 26,000 cubic feet per second spilling, and then Bartlett Dam there on the right, about 32,000 CFS spilling. So we had, and this was a lot in March, so just some of the highlights to point out. We had the wettest March on the Salt and Verde watershed in 30 years, so going back to 1993. We also, on the Verde was quite a bit favored this year than the Salt. We saw the highest April 1 snowpack on the Verde. As Mark mentioned and Aaron mentioned, it stayed cold throughout the winter, and we had a very more of a snow year with some of those March storms, atmospheric rivers mixed in. So we had snowpack that extended throughout the season, and we had the highest April 1 snowpack since 1973 on the Verde watershed. And so we had slightly better than 2010, which was our last biggest snow year. But 2010 on the salt was quite a bit more. We also had the second highest March inflows on the Verde River on record. So we saw quite a bit of inflow during the month of March. That resulted in releases up to peak releases of 37,000 cubic feet per second from Bartlett Dam in March. So these were the highest releases we've probably seen since the mid 90s. We saw close in 2005, maybe 2010, but Roosevelt Lake on the salt side also reached its highest elevation, water lake level elevation that it's ever recorded since modification. The flood control space that was added, it rose about a little more than 4 feet into flood control space. The previous was only slightly more than 1 foot in 2010. And as of early May, SRP reservoirs are 99% full, essentially full, following this wet winter. So that's the highlights. But to show some of the details, if we go to the next slide, where we saw precipitation throughout, following a fairly wet monsoon in July, August, September. The watershed was already fairly, in good conditions with soil moisture, and that continued through the fall and into the winter. We saw a couple short dry periods in November, and then late January and early February, and then now in April. But we saw significant precipitation events, especially in January, early January, and then throughout late February and March. And we saw almost 16 inches of precipitations so far in water year 2023 since October 1st, about 162% of normal as of late April. And this was the wettest fall spring period since 2005. And before that was 1993. As we mentioned, quite a bit colder this year with snowpack. You can see some of these graphs over here and these images of the snowpack. There was a lot of snow out there, especially on the Verde watershed and along the Mogollon Rim areas where we went out and measured 5 feet deep of snow. And this is in March and even into the beginning of April. And you can see the picture on the upper left is in the White Mountains. We saw in March at peak snow, maybe 3 feet of snow, and you can see the bottom, or the top graph is the salt watershed SWE graph, and you can see that it compares. It was above median. The purple line, the blue lines this year, the green line was last year, but not quite as much as 2010, which is our last biggest snow season. But on the Verde side in particular, the bottom graph there, you can see quite the difference, well above the peak average SWE throughout the watershed. We saw SWEs of peak of 17 plus inches average across the water or on the watershed. We went out to many of these sites and measured up to nearly 20 inches of snow water equivalent in 5 feet deep snowpack throughout much of the Verde watershed and the Cragen watershed on the Mogollon Rim. A lot of those areas, you can see the upper two pictures there, doing snow tube sampling. That was 3 tubes, those 30-inch tubes. They don't usually have to, in Arizona, add that third tube to get over 5 feet, but this year we did in many areas. And snow pits, one of our meteorologists like to dig snow pits, and and you can see the stop sign there, give you perspective on how deep that snow was. A lot of that area, especially late into the season, so before that started melting. That picture there on the bottom left was in the Verde watershed at the very end of March, early April. So you can see there's quite a bit. That's as you can see from the graph, that star up there is where you had peak snow melt at very end of March. That's not typical. Typically, it's melted out on the Verde by then. And again, that was the highest Verde snowpack as of April 1 since 1973. So next slide. Where that snow fell, this map just kind of shows that. You can see those purple, pink colors, those higher precipitations. This is for the entire water year since October 1st. You can see that The biggest area is that Mogollon Rim there on the Verde watershed. There's a 41-inch, the Bar M Snowtell site precipitation gauge got over 41 inches of precipitation since October 1st, and 14 inches just in March on that site. That's near Munns Park off the 17. And then areas continued along the Verde and the Mogollon Rim there north of Payson, the Cragen watershed. But you can see some of those March snowstorms. A lot of them added snow, and then a rainstorm in the middle of that started some of those big, impressive runoff events that we saw, and then a mix of rain on snow. And so those events in March, that picture is of Bar M there, not only added rain for runoff, but added snow on top of that. A lot of the rain actually absorbed into the snow, adding to the SWE. And so the SWE got greater after those storms, even though a lot of it was rain. But you can see that total of about 16 inches. The salt, not quite as impressive, except for some areas on the western part of the White Mountains and the White River Basin. Next slide. Speaking of the Cragen watershed, you can see some of that snowpack. This is a channel, a wash in the Cragen watershed, upper part of the Cragen watershed. You can see it's completely covered in snow, about 5 feet of snow up in that area early March. And then some of those mid-March to late March storms started to melt that, break it up, and have flows throughout there. March 16th, the CC Cragen Reservoir started spilling, reached capacity and started spilling. A peak flow over the spillway of about 3,700 CFS, continued to spill throughout March. And then in mid-April, you can see where that peak snowmelt occurred. So that peak snowmelt shifted later into the season, kind of peaking in mid-April and then tailing off through the rest of April and then dropping out in early May. But overall, Cragen spilled 25,000 acre-feet of water, and the reservoir itself only holds 15,000 acre-feet of water. So, next slide. Looking at the entire Salton Verde watershed, we can see this hydrograph. We saw some impressive runoff right away. As we mentioned, the summer monsoon in the fall was fairly wet, keeping conditions favorable for more efficient runoff. So we saw peaks of 20,000 CFS on the Salt and watershed in January from some of those storms right off the bat. More drier stretch, accumulation of snow throughout the watershed in January through February until early March when we saw those big storms, those atmospheric rivers that came through, adding a lot of precipitation across the watershed. So March runoff itself was 877,000 acre-feet of water, which was about 550% of median. It was above the median for the entire winter runoff season of January through May, just in March. It was the second highest on the Verde. It was the third highest overall. March inflows, potentially the second. It's fairly close. See how those numbers pan out. But the first was significantly higher in 1978, about twice that amount. So we're seeing years that are looking like 2005s and potentially even 78 or 93. Not quite 93, but some of those years, either the wet years in these droughts or some years when we saw these wetter periods. Overall, it's about the 10th highest January through April inflow on record on the watershed. So you can see peaks, especially that green line there in the second storm in March, saw inflows of 68,000 CFS on the Verde River. That's the highest inflows we've seen since about 95. And the Salt and Tano, we saw peaks of 29,000 and 26,000 CFS respectively, and those are the highest since about 2010. Overall, January through April is about 1.7 million acre-feet, about a little over 400% of median. If we go to the next slide, as things just show some of those images, even the upper parts of the watershed in the Verde, that upper picture is Solomon Dam, the Big Chino, that last storm hit that area. So we saw significant flows over and from the Big Chino coming down into the Verde. Tano Creek, there's an image of Tano Creek there in the middle that shows it's 26,000 CFS, its highest flow since 2010. And then the bottom image is the Salt River below Tembetown Lake there as releases occurred throughout March. And you can see that significant increase in inflows. This graph shows the blue line was this water year 2023 salt tonneau inflows versus the median and last year's inflows. So a significant increase, especially in the month of March for those inflows. And we expect for the water for the winter runoff January through May of about a little over 1.8 million acre feet, just under 2 million for the water year so far, about 400% of median. Compared to last year, which was only 217,000. Next slide. This graph is looking at releases that we saw from Granite Reef Dam downstream into the Salt River. There's a little bit on here. The blue line's Granite Reef. The black line is the Gila River near Straya Parkway in the West Valley. And the green line is Gila River below Painted Rock Dam. The orangish line that is Roosevelt's elevation, which its y-axis is on the right. But this just shows some of the operations and releases that we saw. If there's a couple clicks to get through this, so if you click one more time, you'll see that in the early part, the first 2 weeks in March, SRP, at the beginning of March, there was 1 million acre feet of water stored up in the snowpack on the Verde watershed. Quite a bit amount. We don't typically, the reservoir still had 50,000 acre feet of capacity. Don't typically start making releases, but with that much snow melt, we started to make low level releases in early March, starting March 2nd. So from 500 up to 3,000 CFS through the early parts, first 2 weeks of March. And once we saw those storms in March in the forecast, started to up those releases to 75 and even more if you click the next one. That time period, that first March storm, we saw releases up to 7,500 to 16,000 cubic feet per second to manage the first storm. And then one more time, click to see those second storm that required peak releases of 37,000 CFS from Bartlett due to that 68,000 CFS inflow. And you can see between those storms, we kept those releases fairly high to build back that storage because there was still quite a bit of snowpack up there, a strong storm in the forecast. So that helped to mitigate the releases from that big storm, but it still was quite a bit of water that was released. You can also notice that the Roosevelt graph there that goes up into the top, that the highest Roosevelt Lake elevation of just over 2155 feet in elevation is about a little over 4 feet in elevation. Next one, those continued through this late March and early April with Roosevelt and flood control space, keeping releases from the salt side. As those Verde inflows started to drop off, most of the releases in late March and early April were from the salt system. And then once it exited flood control space, April 11th, dropped off, but kept lower level releases as inflows were still above demand. We still saw that peak snow melt from the Verde and the salt. The Verde in mid-April, the salt later in April. One more time, and you can see that Roosevelt did re-enter flood control space one more time in late April and then exited in May 10th. So releases did stop on May 12th as inflows have started to drop out below demand. So we stopped releasing water. So we were releasing between March 2nd and May 12th is when releases occurred from Granite Reef into the Salt River. But this just shows you the map just to show that we saw those releases low level for the first 2 weeks. Once we started to get those bigger releases, it's worked its way down to the West Valley by mid-March, by Painted Rock Dam with those bigger releases by March 22nd. Releases started about that time from Painted Rock Dam, reaching the Gila River Dateland by April 22nd, and then the Gila River near Dome by the end of April, and then eventually the Colorado River in early May. So you can see, if you do one more click, you can see that along that entire stretch, not only did you see flows, but you also saw a lot of groundwater recharge occurring. So in the Phoenix AMA, the Gila River, Gila Bend, and the lower Gila areas, quite a bit of recharge. Total spill from the SRP reservoirs was about 730,000 acre feet. Again, a little over 400 was from the Verde, and a little more than 300,000 from the salt. And you can see some numbers for Painted Rock Dam. They had releases up to about 3,800 CFS from Painted Rock Dam. They're starting to decline here as the inflows into the system come down. But this just shows you that the amount of water that went down through the salt and into the Gila, as well as spilling water, but also recharging those groundwater basins. Next slide. So overall, this was numbers from last week, but overall fairly similar today. Still 99% full reservoirs. Inflows are still around demand, so very slowly declining. Reservoir storage increased from 65% to 100% from January 1 to April 1. The deliveries have been a mix between the Salt and Verde to manage those inflows and releases as both systems are full. And then also the impacts, you can see that also having full reservoirs reduced our groundwater usage. Our plan for our project reservoir operations plan down to minimum pumping of about 75,000 acre feet for our groundwater use, to use more of the surface water supply for 2023. Next slide. So that is what happened in the Salt and Verde this year with all of the runoff that we saw through the Salt River. This is a picture of Granite Reef Dam releasing water during those peak releases. Again, reservoirs 99% full. Significant March runoff with some of those releases from the Verde. A 1.8 million acre feet for winter runoff, which is about 400% of median. And then SRP again, looking at going forward. Mark mentioned the summer monsoon outlook in the winter. We typically we've seen dry winters followed by wet monsoons like we saw the last two. But when we have wet winters like this, it may have a delay to the start of the monsoon and then potentially a drier monsoon that we've seen after these wetter winters. But with the El Nino looking towards next year, we hope to see another wet winter in 2024. Just a couple updates from SRP. We're continuing to work on the collaborative projects with SCIF and the Bartlett modification project from Roosevelt FCS. They're still in the works. Going forward for more long-term water projects, as well as announced that Charlie Esther has now replaced Bruce Howland as the SRP Director of Water Supply this spring going forward. So those are some updates from SRP and the update on the SRP water supply in the Salt and Verde River. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Questions from members around the table? Questions from members online? Thanks for the presentation.
Thank you.
Next we will be going to a presentation on the 2023 wildfire outlook. Derek Piper from the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management.
Good morning, people in the room, people online. Thank you for having us here. I'm going to go a little bit into hopefully an echo of the weather folks and the folks here about the drought, monsoons, and then a little bit of statistics on fires and what it could look like for this summer. So the first, this was updated as of this month. First few slides here. Potential fire activity in the southern part of the state. It's going to be a progression from the southern part of the state to the northern part of the state. As far as the drought goes, Predictive Services out of Albuquerque, it's trending towards kind of that plains, panhandle of Texas, Oklahoma, where the severe drought is going to be centered over. And a normal monsoon or normal pattern here in Arizona in the Southwest, as of, like I said, May, whatever normal, if you can call it normal, fire season, that's what they're predicting. So we're out of the extreme drought here, but we're not out of the woods. The consensus throughout the state, because I am out and about driving as an assistant prevention, is a little bit of a false sense of security because of the moisture this winter. People think that it'll be okay to burn and have campfires, and we're not out of the woods yet. We're still in a drought, and it is drying out. So the next 4 slides, next slide, please. So this is just progression. Like I said, it was updated in May. And top left corner, this month on to August, and this will be the last update from Predictive Services. Basically highlighting again, they're putting us in this region, Western Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona in a normal setup for wildland fires. Again, it's going to move, and what we're seeing the last 2 weeks, 30 days here is an uptick in wildfires, especially down south. I would say since February it started, it is now getting more consistent with wildfires and human-caused starts down south, and it's just going to progress to the northern part of the state as the fine fuels are dried out or drying out, and then the heavier fuels, the bushes, the trees, continue to dry out. So again, it's just echoing a lot of the weather and people's false sense of security because of the moisture and the shot of moisture we got this winter. And then the delayed onset of monsoons coming up in the next slides here. Again, seasonal factors, US Drought Monitor. As of today, I think is the last time I looked at it, down in this portion of the Yuma portion of the state, Colorado River. That is where it is saying it is a little drier. Today, I just looked at it on Predictive Services. But for that whole Colorado River, up the western part of the state, that's where the US Drought Monitor is focusing in on. Next slide, please. Okay, and again, the 2023, the monsoon, again, red highlighted. La Nina conditions, but El Nino, ENSO. Later this summer, it is going to be a delayed onset monsoons, like we've already heard, which could delay moisture, which again, that false sense of security with the public that it's okay to burn, and it's not yet, and it is going to dry out. We aren't going to get that shot of moisture that we usually do. The unofficial start date of monsoons, usually around the 4th, or it could be a very dry monsoon season, which could lead to lightning start fires. Slide, please. Again, for the droughts, extreme drought, there's that Panhandle Plains, the Front Range of Colorado, moving down into the Panhandle of Texas, Oklahoma. That's where they see the extreme drought centered over. And then normal again, normal for this region, Arizona. But again, it's a false sense of security people are having because of the moisture this winter. Little statistics from previous years, year to date. So 229 fires for 4,000 acres burned, as opposed to 318 fires, 22,000 acres burned, and totaling 1,400 fires with 124,000 acres burned for 2022. Again, fire activity the last 4 years, 19, obviously 2020 was a significantly dry, hot summer. We had an uptick in fire incidents, also in acres burned for the state. Most of our fires are human caused. So 2022, 66, down to 2018, 69% human caused. Right now, we are still in a preparedness level 2 for the nationally and region. We are not in any kind of fire restrictions as of yet. Give it another 30 days here. That could change, especially down south. Those counties could start going into fire restrictions. None of the fires that have started right now have, to my knowledge, broken 1,000 acres. If they have, it's not much over, so we're not seeing hundreds of thousands by any means. They are small. We are catching them small right now. But again, as those fuels start to dry out, that could change everyone's awareness and the state's awareness and the Fed cooperators to maybe start moving up that preparedness level and also fire restrictions. So we work with a lot of cooperators, federal, local, 260 local fire departments, districts with qualified wildland firefighters. Department has access to 2,500 wildland firefighters. DFFM has 13 wildland hand crews, 12 are type 2, and 1, the Phoenix crew, is a type 2 IA, initial attack crew. Again, we do partnership with the U.S. Forest Service, Mesa. We have Mesa as a tanker base, which they can take a very large air tanker, excuse me, the DC-10, and also the smaller large air tankers. And then we have our seat base down in Marana, which are small crop duster type planes. And then a handful of air attack platforms that are spread out, at least regionally throughout the state as we go into fire season. They get placed here, Prescott, all over the state. And we also utilize DPS as far as fire, either with water or recons and the National Guard. Thank you. If you have any other questions, you can reach my email, dpiper, or media@dffm.az.gov.
Thanks, Derek. Questions for members around the table first? Seeing none. Any online? Thanks, Derek. Go then to the next item, impacts of drought on hydropower. Ed Garak from the Irrigation and Electric Association of Arizona is going to give us that presentation. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Tom. The next two are drought impacts on hydropower. Jack and I coordinated some on our presentations. Since Jack's a federal employee, he has to stay professional. I get to say all the things he wants to say. So I've titled this topic, Some Energy is Sacrificed, in homage to the Supplemental Environmental Impact Statement. So next slide, please. IEDA, Irrigation Electrical District Association, we've been around since 1962. We're a collection of 25 irrigation electrical district associations, some municipalities with their own public power services, and 2 tribal entities. Next slide, please. We've learned from Seinfeld that double dipping is not good, but if this last wet winter is any indication, I'll take a triple dip La Nina any year. We've had 31 atmospheric rivers and, way above normal precipitation. So next slide, please. All that precipitation has been beneficial to the basin, especially with the Colorado River Storage Project. This map represents the CRETA members that have allocations from CRISP. Arizona gets about 18% of the CRISP project power, and the IEDA members get about 6% in total. So next slide, please. These were the projections we were looking at the beginning of the year. So Glen Canyon dams slowly dropped, and as releases have shrunk or been curtailed, we continue to see a reduction of what we call CROD, contracted rate of delivery. What was planned for 2023 at about 70.5%, and 2024, which we were looking at almost 64% of CROD, has come back with a vengeance. Next slide, please. So all the wet winter, all the wet weather and the increased releases planned out of Glen Canyon, you can see some significant increases. What this translates to is in 2023, out of the CRISP projects, we're going to see about 26% more energy than what we initially thought. In 2024, Obviously, these are subject to change, but it could potentially be an increase of 24% off our initial projections. Next slide, please. But, you know, not everything has a silver lining. You guys may have heard of the April HFE. It was a 72-hour high flow experiment meant to build beaches downstream of Glen Canyon Dam. The initial projections are it would cost the power customers $1.4 million. What's ironic is that it wasn't a spring HFE and it didn't meet the sediment triggers that were called for in the LTEMP. So, but the upper basin director thought, hey, it was close enough, so let's do it anyway. So, next slide, please. Another big issue that is still pending is the smallmouth bass. This is a non-native fish that was introduced upstream of Glen Canyon Dam back in the 80s. It's been found downstream of Glen Canyon Dam since 2003, but due to the lowering of the lake elevations and the warming of the water, they were worried that it might cause the smallmouth bass to get established downstream. Now they've been there since 2003, but they were worried that they would spawn and proliferate and then go on to consume chub. Now the chub have been recently downlisted within the last couple of years. They're at around mile marker 70 or so. So they rushed an EA, but they couldn't achieve a FONSI. Why that is even though they projected that the impacts to power of a 5-month bypass was $81 million, that was about probably half of what it truly was. It's closer to north of $160 million. It would have crashed the basin fund, which is the fund that the upper basin customers use to help pay the power bill, the bills associated with CRISP. And so what's coming is an EIS, environmental impact statement, is likely going to occur next few months. Hopefully that you guys can weigh in to help support the reduce the impact of power. WAPA had presented a alternative that wasn't even considered. It was dismissed that would have allowed for running a disruption flow through the generators, minimizing the loss of hydropower, and it wasn't even considered by the EA. So next slide, please. Now here's the projections on market costs, and that's why I wanted to share with you the, you can see it's about $250 during the summer. The EA projected about $135 million for replacement power, if you could even find it. And that's becoming more and more of a concern, just to see the loss of 5 months of generation from Glen Canyon Dam would have put SRP's RA at risk. They had some current concerns about some of that, and just the western-wide energy on the spot market's getting tougher and tougher to find. So next slide, please. Moving on to Hoover, this is where some of the energy is getting sacrificed. The proposed SEIS, the tier 1, would reduce Hoover generation about 6% for more than what it is this year. Next slide, please. So that truly isn't a Vegas vacation. Tier 2A would have been is a 7% cut. Tier 2B would result in a 10% cut of what it is today. Next slide, please. You can see that we were really looking at some below minimum power pools in, as it closed in on 2024. Thankfully, the wet hydrology will keep us up in that tier 1, which is beneficial, but it's still a loss of energy compared to this year. Next slide, please. In reading the SAS, I was amazed at the how the 480,000 that was held up in Lake Powell just seemed to magically disappear if alternative 1 and alternative 2 were selected. I don't know if you guys remember the movie Better Off Dead, but this particular newspaper boys kept chasing somebody all around through the movie, wanting his $2 back. So just wanted to highlight that, and hopefully that the plan is to get that 480,000 downstream this year. Next slide, please. And not that it's a drought-related impact, but something that I wanted to make sure people are aware of. There's a huge distribution transformer shortage going on right now. It used to take 12 to 16 weeks of lead time to get new transformers, are north of 52 weeks, and they're costing about triple what they are. There was also a DOE proposed notice of proposed rulemaking that would change the design of these distribution transformers in 2027, which further exacerbates some supply chain issues. So what you see on the right-hand side of the slide is the shelves during the great toilet paper shortage of 2021. This is what I equate to the transformer shortage that is coming. So you guys just be aware, especially in a high growth state with like Arizona, most electric vehicles, level 2 electric vehicle chargers, two of those will need to necessitate a replacement of the distribution transformers that are in existence right now, because you're adding so much draw on that transformer that you need to be replaced. So something to be aware of from a Arizona's power perspective. So happy to answer any questions. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Ed. Before I ask for questions, let me address the 480 issue. So within the 9.3, I think it was million acre feet balancing release that James referred to, the 480 is in there. And we understand that at least on paper, the hydrograph is being adjusted so that we get the whole 9.3 water year release by the end of September 30th. We think they're capable of doing that, right? So we'll see what happens. But I also want to point out for folks that don't know this, that the upper basin, through their drought operation agreement, put somewhere around 600,000 acre feet of water into Lake Powell, mostly from Flaming Gorge. And as part of actions that occurred earlier this spring, they're on a path to recover that storage in those reservoirs, essentially Flaming Gorge. Again, taking advantage of the good hydrology, recovering that water so that hopefully, or not hopefully, if we won't need it again out into the future, but if we do, they'd be able to do a drawer release. So some balancing definitely going on there. Always appreciate hearing the details on the impacts of what's happening with the operations at Powell and Meade on power. Fortunately, this good year is helping out a little bit at least. So questions for Ed around the table? Questions for Ed on the webinar?
Just a comment saying thank you for pointing out the
Sure.
Thanks, Ed.
Yeah.
We will move then to the next presentation, impacts of drought on hydropower from WAPA, the Western Area Power Administration, Jack Murray.
All right. Good morning. It's always tough to follow a presentation that Ed does because his are way more entertaining than mine. Anyway, I appreciate you folks having me here to visit with you this morning. We can go ahead and go on to the next slide. For those of you that don't know who WAPA is, we're Western Area Power Administration. We are federal agency, as Ed mentioned, one of 4 power marketing administrations in the country that are within the Department of Energy. WAPA's headquarters are near Denver, Colorado, and the Desert Southwest Regional Office that I support is located here in Phoenix. We're a wholesale supplier of electricity, and we market and deliver the federal hydropower in the Desert Southwest region off the dams in the Colorado River. When we say we're a wholesale provider of electricity, that means that we sell our electricity to, co-ops, municipalities, tribal nations, some military installations and other nonprofits, and they in turn take that and use it as part of their portfolio that serves more than 40 million folks across the West. WAPA has, as you can see on that map there, WAPA has about a 15-state footprint that spans pretty much the western and into the central U.S. And in addition to marketing that energy, We've got about 17,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines that we own, operate, and maintain. Within the Desert Southwest region here, again, where I'm from, power is generated from 4 federal dams that are operated by the Bureau of Reclamation on the Colorado River. We, in Desert Southwest, we get some power from Glen Canyon, and then Hoover, Davis, and Parker dams further downstream. Next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about Parker Davis project. In power marketing administration parlance, Parker Davis is marketed as a firm product, which means that we, WAPA, are contractually obligated to deliver our customers a set amount of power. So if generation is reduced because of poor hydrology, that means we have to go out on the market and buy that power to make up the difference. So this graph really shows the amount of generation of Parker Davis for fiscal year 2023. So the information for the first 6 months is actual, and then the next 6 months is projected. In blue, we show the power for each month of the year that we've generated. And you'll see in total, that's about 1,212 gigawatt hours of generation. That generation is shaped based on water releases, so it's higher in the spring and summer compared to the rest of the year, which makes sense since we have a lot of agriculture in Arizona. In orange, we show the amount of purchases that are needed for each month. In total, we're projecting to be purchasing for the year about 218 gigawatt hours of power. So we're forecasting to purchase rather than generate. What that's showing is about 15% of the power that we'll sell our customers. First thing people say is 15% doesn't sound too bad. But if you go to the next slide, we'll kind of take a look at what that means. And Ed talked a little bit about this. But this slide shows the price of the purchases. If you see the orange bars show the average purchase price by month for fiscal year 23. Shows 6 months of actual, again, October 1 through March 31. And then the rest is forecasted. As you can see on the graph, the purchase prices run from a low of about $41 a megawatt hour to a high of about $305 a megawatt hour. The problem with showing an average is it's a little bit misleading because it doesn't show those months where during peak hours we're paying north of $1,000 a megawatt hour for power. We try to minimize that exposure by making purchases of power in advance, but that has its own inherent risks. You might not need the power when you've purchased it for and that sort of thing. So really the takeaway for this slide is that those blue bars show the rate, the price that we sell Parker Davis power for. So it's about $18 a megawatt hour. And we're out purchasing, as you can see, in the hundreds of dollars per megawatt hour on a good day. So we're in the sell low, buy high mode of operations, unfortunately. If we go to the next slide, we can kind of pull all this together and show you what that means dollar-wise for our customers. So for fiscal year 2023, we said we're purchasing about 218 gigawatt hours of electricity. That purchase cost is $34.1 million. And to kind of give you some perspective, it costs about $18 million to operate the generating units at Parker and Davis. So I said that right. It's about 184% of the total cost of operating the units that we're spending on purchase power because of the hydrology and because of the market. As you take more power out of the market, it gets harder to find, as Ed mentioned, and the price goes up. So 2024, you can see here, is looking a little bit better, but those prices are estimated. And truthfully, my own editorial comment is I don't see those prices going down. And as you get further out, it shows the price is kind of normalizing, and I just don't see that happening. So anyway, if we go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about a drought cost estimate. One thing I wanted to point out from that last slide is when we're purchasing power, when we're going out and having to spend $34 million in purchase power costs, that doesn't change the operating costs of the dams. The dams still have to be, maintained and in good operating order by the Bureau of Reclamation. So it's just additional added costs onto the customers. Now I wanted to take just a brief look at Hoover Dam and Parker Davis, but Ed alluded to it a little bit with the reduction of hydropower at Hoover Dam. What we did in our region was try to put a cost to the customers. What's that going to look like in terms of cost to them? So we've created this estimate, really, what is the drought costing our Hoover and Parker Davis customers? And we tried to consider the cost of everything. There's a direct rate impact. And just to explain that real briefly, as there's less power generated, the cost per unit of power goes up. So that means the power that's coming out is getting more expensive. The replacement power, because we're generating less, customers have to go out and buy more to make up the difference. We do have, we've got renewable energy certificates that are associated with Hoover Dam with less generation. There's a cost there because those aren't available. We tried to take into account everything associated with Hoover Dam from a cost perspective that's impacted by the drought. Bottom line is that over the next, 7 years, that's about $834 million for Hoover customers, or $119 million a year. And for Parker Davis, it's about $42 million or $4 million a year directly related to drought costs. And it's important to note, these don't include any reductions. We've heard it mentioned a couple times today. The supplemental environmental impact statement, changes that might come from that, depending on what if anything gets implemented or changed. So this doesn't include any projections for changes from that effort. These also don't include any costs specific to our customers, such as impact to agriculture. I mentioned agriculture a minute ago. Lost production or opportunity costs. That's just the cost to reduce power. And quite frankly, we don't expect that to be higher. I mean, we had a great year this year. Hydrology is a little better, generation's a little bit better, but we're still way down from where we've been in the past. So if generation continues to be subpar, and power costs on the market continue to be high, which we expect to see, we expect this to be a continuing theme. Improvements for this year, sure, but still a trend of increasing costs. And if we go to the last slide, this is just on this slide. I really wanted to show the Arizona customers that take power from Hoover and Parker Davis and that are directly adversely affected by hydrology. And these are entities and communities that are directly impacted. And when I say that, because the overall costs in terms of their economic losses, as those losses trickle down through the economy, are hard to measure. At least it's hard to measure for me. I'm not an economist. But as an example, agriculture alone in Arizona is about $23 billion industry. And if you look on there, you can see a lot of customers that are associated with agriculture: Walton Mohawk, Yuma County Water Users, Yuma Irrigation District, San Carlos Irrigation and Drainage District, probably some ag going on there. Lots of agriculture in Arizona. And that industry is dependent on power to deliver its water. And if they've got less power, costs them more to deliver, it's a sizable impact. So I just wanted to point that out. And with that, I'll take any questions if anyone has any.
Thanks, Jack. Questions? Members around the table? Questions online? Thanks, Jack.
Thanks, Tom.
Next, we'll hear about impacts of drought on Navajo Nation. Carly McClellan, the senior hydrologist from Navajo Nation, Department of Water Resources. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you for having me, members of the committee, and those of you who are online. So we've had definitely an interesting winter. We started off kind of grim and then ended up with a surprise snowpack this season. So these are just slides I included, you know, just some of the things that the water monitoring inventory and some of their objectives and our program, what we oversee, and a lot of surface water monitoring. So next slide. And I just included some ongoing repeating drought vulnerabilities that Navajo Nation faces. Next slide. Again, that's just some objectives from our Navajo Nation drought contingency plan. Next slide. And this is just a flow chart of just some of the you know, drought planning that happens depending on drought severity for Navajo Nation. Next slide. And next slide, just a continuation of the previous one. So we do have 85 rain cans that we monitor monthly. So those are that's just a breakdown. Just next slide. That just shows you a map of all the rain cans that we have. You can see that most of the rain cans are predominantly scattered and populated throughout the Cheska Mountains. Next slide. And so this is 6-month SPIs compiled from Climate Engine and GridMet, going back from November 6th of 2022 to May 5th of this year. So next slide. So this is just you can see the 6-month SPIs. You can see that the SPI values were like around November. They were, you know, around 1. And you can see there was a little bit of a peak with the winter season. And this is actually for the Chinle Agency. So you can see there was a considerable increase of the SPI and improvements during the winter months, all the way through January into February. You can see that decline, and then early March it went back up, and then it's kind of tapering back off again. So we are seeing a considerable warming in the Chinle area. Next slide. This one is Fort Defiance Agency. You can see, again, you know, very similar patterns with the SPIs. Again, you know, we see some of the similar trends where we had a little bit of a trough in between late February. Next slide. And this is Western Navajo, Western Agency. Again, you know, this is similar as well. So next slide. So again, this is actually, so the previous one, those were 6-month SPIs. These are just actual precipitation numbers from the start of the calendar year to May 6th. So next slide. Again, so this here is for Chinle Agency, and we had some pretty good peaks around early January, and then some around early February, and then you had some peaks are here up in early March through late March. So I'll be talking a little bit more about Chinle as well, especially with the flooding that, you know, that was on the news. But next slide. Fort Defiance Agency, again, very similar trends. Next slide. And this again is also Western Navajo. So very similar. I think a lot of the what we've been seeing through the atmospheric rivers and a lot of the winter fronts, they're a little bit more, you know, broad, the storms, and so which are a little bit more different. Summers you get a lot of more of the isolated showers, and so I think, you know, you get a lot of the larger winter fronts, and so you get a lot of the very similar patterns throughout the region there. So Next slide. Again, this here, snow courses for this year. I didn't include all the snow courses, I only included a few of them. And so this is from the snow season, January 1st to April 1st of this year. Next slide. So this one here, the Fluted Rock Snow Course, it's on the Defiance Plateau. So you can see that the average snow depth is in blue. And you can see that the end of the season, around April 1st, you know, we were hitting right around 25 inches of snowpack there, average snowpack. And then the red line is the water content, and then the snow density was the water content in inches, and then the snow density in gray. So, but next slide. So that one is for, this one here is for Bull Canyon, and this one here, if you look at the average snow depth in blue, the end of the snow season, we measured pretty close to 5 feet, right around 60 inches. Next slide. And this one here is for the Beaver Springs Snowtell site. See in blue the snow water equivalent, and also the snow depth in black. And you can see the considerable snow peaks in right around early March. So at the end of the season for Beaver Springs, we were over 5 feet as well too on the snowpack. Next slide. And then this one here is Whiskey Creek Snowtell site. Again, at the end of the snow season on April 1st, we were measuring about over 5 feet of snow as well. Next slide. So, you know, as a result of like, we've had some pretty good snowpacks in the in previous years. I know like 2010, I know that was a pretty good snow season, but you know, the town of Chinle, or they've had some flooding in the past, periodically here and there, but it's never been, the flooding's never been as bad as it has been this particular year. And so these are a lot of the reports we've been getting from the Chinle chapter house, and a lot of the people that were responding to the flooding and the FEMA response there. Reports we're hearing said it was by far the worst in decades as far as flooding is concerned. So I think a lot of that attributed to the high snowpack and kind of a rapid snow melt. So next slide. So these are just some pictures I took in the through that Chinle Valley area, where the closest to where the wash runs, and so that we had some considerable flooding that actually buried some cars, and actually there's a few homes that were halfway covered as well. Next slide. You know, and that's just some of the you know, response, FEMA response that was taking place by different community members, and trying to redivert some of that water away from going into the residential areas. Next slide. Again, that's that same vehicle from before, just at a different angle. Next slide. You know, that's near the Holiday Inn in Chinle. There was that some teams that were out there and helping and assisting. They had Red Cross and a number of different organizations that, like a backhoe, and they were digging quite a bit, you know, trying to create a berm to redirect that water. I think a lot of the waters has gone down, and so we have most of the snow melt that's kind of run through now. So I think they're in the recovery stage now, the town of Chinle there. And so next slide. So next slide. This one here, this is from the U.S. Drought Monitor. So we're actually, Navajo Nation's actually doing pretty well as far as having as far as the drought's concerned, we don't have any major issues as of right now, except maybe like in the upper portions of Coconino County. Next slide. This is just a 24-week change that I included. And so it looks like, there's a lot of improvements in the drought that kind of happened up in the upper Coconino and Navajo County areas as well. See that the 24-week change as well. So, and that kind of concludes my presentation. Next slide. So with that, I'll take any questions if there are any.
Thanks, Carly. Questions from members around the table? Online questions from members? No. Thanks, Carly. Okay, our last presentation, impacts of drought on the Gila River Indian community. Jason Howder. Jason's with us online.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you,
Okay.
Jason.
All right. Last, and I only have a few slides, so shouldn't take too long. This is really just an update from a presentation I did last year. The focus is on the community's conservation efforts in the Colorado River system. That said, I know it wasn't touched on. It was touched about the Salt River and Verde. The community also relies on the Gila River mainstream quite a bit. And I was looking at the San Carlos Reservoir. Last year, there was roughly 1,300 acre feet in the San Carlos Reservoir. There's currently more than 518,000 acre feet in the San Carlos Reservoir, which is it's much improved throughout the state in terms of the situation we're in. And the community's reliance on the Gila River water is very important. So that's not the focus of what I'll be talking about, but I wanted just to touch on that. So I'm not going to go over what everyone said. It's a much improved situation. It's really kind of a short-term thing, though. As we know, long-term, we still have some issues within the Colorado River that we're still dealing with, whether that's through the, well, it wouldn't be the draft SEIS, that's more near-term, but ultimately the longer-term we're going to have to deal with in the post-2026 guidelines. Really, some background on this slide is really just background on this community CAP water. It has, it's the largest entitlement holder of CAP water of 311,800 acre feet. And most of that water, as everyone knows, comes from the Colorado River. The community settlement, really, it's an in-lieu supply. The community wasn't an on-river tribe, and to facilitate the community's claims, the community was willing to take CAP water in lieu of its claims on the Gila River and Salt River. Among the water that the community has in the CAP system are really in two priorities, a little over 120,000 acre feet in the lower NIA priority, and over 190,000 acre feet in the more senior Indian priority. The community's major involvement in conservation is really directly related to the significant risk to its CAP water supply. And so that's why it's been very involved in conservation efforts. Go to the next slide, please. So the community's drought concerns as it relates to the Colorado River is really, really focused on this disappearing NIA priority CAP water. It's a major concern. The community has, as I said, 120,000, a little over 120,000 acre feet of non-Indian ag priority CAP water. And it's really kind of what I would call the community's flex supply to use. It currently uses a lot of that for conservation. In the past, it's used it to create long-term storage credits. A lot of those credits were created in some of the surrounding irrigation districts. And as DCP has cut that supply, and as the community has moved more of that water to Lake Mead rather than through storage, it's impacted the community's on-reservation activities as well as off-reservation activities, and it's impacted others as well. The community in the past is still supportive of the DCP, but is very concerned when we fall below Tier 1, and really, when that happens, the NIA supply is pretty much gone, and that's the case this year. There's only a little bit of NIA water available. Longer term, as reclamation and the basin states try to figure out a longer term solution, the community is very concerned that some of that, and it's unclear how much of the NIA priority water is likely going to be permanently or semi-permanently lost. And so it's the focus of the community kind of long-term of finding replacement water for that water. So next slide. So in terms of recent conservation efforts, this slide goes through a couple of the some of the activities in the DCP. The first few bullets, DCP and 500 plus. But more recently, the community entered into a 3-year system conservation implementation agreement for up to 125,000 acre feet per year of conservation, starting this year and ending 2025. That's part of the Inflation Reduction Act lower basin conservation program that reclamation is funding. And the other agreement that the community entered into, and kind of in many ways the more exciting agreement, is the funding for this construction of a reclaimed water pipeline that really enables the community to maximize the use of reclaimed water it receives under exchanges with the cities of Chandler and Mesa pursuant to its settlement, and be able to take that water. And this is really important because Mesa's on the verge of completing a pipeline to maximize their reclaimed water exchange under this under our agreement. And currently, where the turnout is, it's in a place in the reservation where it's kind of limited use, or it's kind of we're already maxed out. And this pipeline will allow us to move that water kind of upstream in our system to the top of our system, so we can use it in more places. And our estimates that will result in kind of, in terms of our demand of on-reservation CAP water demand, a reduction of about 20,000 acre feet per year. So it'll be very helpful. And it's an example of using infrastructure or having funding infrastructure projects that result in long-term conservation. Next slide, please. So this is my only, graph, and really it just demonstrates the community's drought response and its conservation efforts in a variety of ways. So all total, there's roughly from 2016 to 2023, the community's conserved to the benefit of Lake Mead about 733,000 acre feet. It will have by the end of this year. The breakdown really is about 280,000 acre feet through system conservation, paid system conservation. Some of the cuts in the gray are really depicting DCP cuts, and some of those are mitigated. But the community was willing to take mitigation in the form of monetary mitigation rather than wet water mitigation, and so really it's a reduction in water supplies as well. So through the DCP kind of cuts, whether some of that's partially mitigated or partially compensated, I should say, and partially mitigated, those equate to a roughly 134,000 acre feet. And then the balance of that, and really in the orange, is nearly 320,000 acre feet of intentionally created surplus in Lake Mead under a number of agreements, and then voluntarily just on its own, the community has created since starting in 2019 and created some last year as well. So all total, again, 733,000 acre feet of conservation to date. Probably another 200 plus acre feet of conservation over the next couple of years, depending on how much water we have available, plus DCP cuts. So the community, by the end of the guideline deadline, I expect the community to be well over 1 million acre feet of conservation since 2016. Go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the drought impact to the community directly, since 2019, the community's had to curtail some of its off-reservation storage activities that I mentioned, shift that water to Lake Mead. That's impacted local irrigation districts. The community last year reduced some of its farming activity to free up water for conservation, to maximize conservation. Ultimately, the community would like to get to increase its ag development. It doesn't discourage that on reservation, but it's not taking, it's not pushing it very, very hard yet. If farmers or growers need water, we'll make water available and find ways to get water to them, even if it's Colorado River water. But long-term, the goal of council is really to increase ag development on reservation. I would like to note that there's also a substantial opportunity cost to conservation, even though a lot of it's paid. It's at rates substantially lower than what the community would expect if it was storing water, creating long-term storage credits, and then marketing those credits. So, I think there's to some degree a sense that the community's really focused on the money here. It's focused on fairness, but it's also trying to help in terms of meet the challenges that we all face. As I said, there's a concern with NIA priority cap water. The community really wants to reduce its reliance on CAP water to the degree possible. The RWPP pipe project is an example of that. But long term, the community will need to find some replacement water because it expects permanent cuts to the NIA priority cap pool. And I think, is this the last slide? Okay. So that's basically that's all I have. So any questions?
Thank you, Jason. Questions from members around the table? Questions online? No questions, Jason. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So now we come to the purpose of all of these presentations. That's to synthesize all of this information we have heard and discuss making a recommendation to the governor about continuing the drought declaration. So to facilitate that conversation, first I'll ask if Alan would like to give his view, and then I'll give mine, and we can go around the table if we need to.
Thank you, Director. So a lot of presentations, a lot of unknowns. The one thing I did take away, and I might have missed all or none of it, but the one thing that I did take away is that we've had a very wet year this past year. History trend seems to trend that after a wet year, we have several dry years to follow. And so though our state looks very good at this point and our water levels look very good at this point, I'm hesitant to make a consideration that we move away from a declaration because I'm not sure what the next few years are going to hold. And so therefore my recommendation would be to let the declaration stand at this point, at least until we get a few more years of what we believe would be trending moisture and a better understanding of what we may have in the future years.
Thanks, Alan. And from my perspective, to summarize what I heard, clearly we had one good year. Mostly we saw benefit. We saw some flooding, Navajo Nation, and some other issues. I know there's been minimal, but some flooding down in the Yuma area from the water being released out of Painted Rock Dam. I've heard in the presentations that temperature and precipitation trends are not favorable moving forward, that we're still in an overall drought long term, that we need several good years in a row before we got out of that drought. The Colorado River, while we had a good year, again, we've seen bad years after good years as kind of a trend there. We heard the issues about wildfire risk, especially in Cochise County and Santa Cruz County in southern Arizona. We've definitely heard, as well as in the fire presentation, that most of the fires, well over 70% or so, are from human causes. I think maintaining the drought declaration sends the right message to the public that we still got a problem and they need to be careful of what they're doing. Certainly, we heard hundreds of millions of dollars worth of impacts on the power folks. So again, I will just say to the group, in my opinion, we should recommend that the drought declaration continue. I'll let folks weigh in, or if they just want to agree with that, that's fine. If they want to make specific points, first we'll go around the table. Anyone around the table want to weigh in? Anyone around the table disagree with maintaining the declaration? No takers on either, so how about online? So it sounds by unanimous consensus, if there is such a thing, that we're going to recommend to the governor that the drought declaration continue, as is the practice. Nemesis and staff will work on writing up that recommendation letter. We have a comment?
We do have a comment from Mark. I second the continuation of drought declaration. One good year doesn't alleviate long-term issues and impacts. It would be negligent to remove drought declaration on hoping there's going to be more wet years.
Thanks, Mark. Well said. So I think we put that item to bed. I'll make a call to the public. Anyone want to address our group? Seeing none, move on to closing remarks. I want to thank all of you who spoke today. I want to thank everyone that has worked on all the committees to make all of this possible. And I have a sad closing for me and the Department of Water Resources and for this group. So Nemesis, our drought coordinator in DWR, and obviously the person who's been facilitating this group in these meetings since 2019, is going to be leaving us and going back to Puerto Rico. So we will definitely miss you. I want to thank you, Nemesis, for your professionalism, your dedication, for all the great work you've done for this group, and the bigger picture drought management for the Department of Water Resources. We will miss you, and if you decide to come back, give me a call and I'll find someplace in my department for you. Your Nemesis is one of the people I rely on. I don't need to worry about what Nemesis is doing. I know she is going to do a fantastic job with any assignment she has. And for someone who's trying to manage a couple of hundred people, those people are invaluable to me. So thank you for everything you've done, Nemesis. With that, I think we are adjourned. Thank you all.